Following the collapse of Saigon, hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese fled the country to avoid persecution by the communist government. Families left their homeland with nothing but the shirts on their backs, often squeezing into overcrowded boats and trying their luck on the open ocean, risking death to avoid execution by the victorious North Vietnamese. Many of these refugees were settled in the United States. Having overcome adversity like this, you may be surprised that when it comes to seeking higher education, the ethnic background of the descendants of these Indo-Chinese refugees is actually a hindrance to their acceptance into schools in most states. However, the hypothetical middle-class son of a lawyer who happens to be African American is given special privileges due to the circumstances of his ethnicity. To most people, it does not make sense that the daughter of a refugee should have more stringent college application standards than the son of a college-educated professional, but this is the policy of the majority of the country today. As demonstrated by the recent unfortunate case with Officer Washington, affirmative action and diversity hirings here in Missouri are now policies under review. It is my goal through this speech to persuade you to oppose affirmative action. For the purpose of this speech, I am a media relations officer who has studied public policy with an emphasis on affirmative action in the United States. I will tell you today about some of the history of affirmative action, some of the arguments surrounding affirmative action, and what we should do about it and why. Affirmative action history begins with President Kennedy and was built up mainly through subsequent presidents Johnson and Nixon through the 60s and 70s. It has an original intent of attempting to remediate centuries of slavery and mistreatment of blacks by whites. Since its inception, it has been constantly challenged both in education and the workplace. I'll show a visual aid here. I know this is a bulleted list, but it shows a small sample of various affirmative action cases brought to the Supreme Court for the last 40 years of its history. And although I'm not going to go through every single one individually because it would take too long, it shows you that the court has, over the past 40 years, gone back and forth multiple times on this issue, which to most people is a sign that the constitutionality of affirmative action is itself at question often. And the courts have, in the past, multiple times decided that certain situations affirmative action is unconstitutional. Moving on, one of the biggest falsehoods presented by proponents of affirmative action is that it does not give a substantial advantage to different ethnic groups. According to data collected by Dr. Mark J. Perry from the Association of American Medical Colleges concerning acceptance rates for given MCAT GPA and races published in February 11, 2011, we can see that is not the case. Here we can see that the acceptance rates for Asians and whites are considerably lower than for Hispanics and blacks. And especially when you get down to the lower performers on MCAT scores on the far left of your screen, you can see that the chance of an Asian American entering medical school with the same scores as a Black American is almost impossible. The blue line in the middle shows the median score for acceptance by medical schools, and the far right shows the upper echelon of students. But as you clearly see from this graph, it is almost impossible for people of certain ethnicities, especially Asians, to get into medical school with the same scores as people of other ethnicities. Another myth is that the impoverished minority students admitted to these schools often do better than white counterparts. Thomas Howell, in his October 2004 article in the Hoover Digest, reports a different picture. There's a disproportionate amount of benefits for blacks go to the upper and middle class, not the downtrodden, less fortunate ones that we're told about. He also goes on to report that blacks are more frequently less academically prepared and face a higher dropout rate. The final defense of affirmative action is its correction for mistreatment of blacks. Firstly, making things more difficult for Asian applicants does not in any way accomplish this goal. Secondly, punishing white sons for the sins of their fathers, or in the case of most white people, someone else's ancestors. This is in direct opposition to the position of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said to the newly mobilized black community in his address in front of the Lincoln Memorial, "In the process of gaining a rightful place, we must not be guilty of the wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred." In other words, retribution is not the appropriate course when seeking equality. Affirmative action, finally, gives ammunition to those trying to criticize and downplay the achievements of minorities in professions and academia. The policy itself feeds racism and takes away the importance of the accomplishments of minorities. Lastly, what should we do about affirmative action? The state of Missouri should pass a proposition to outlaw affirmative action. This has already been done in several states. As you can see from this diagram, there are 7 states which have, in the last 20 years, passed anti-affirmative action legislation, which guarantees that all people are treated equally under the law. This has been upheld by the Supreme Court in the Schuette versus Coalition to Defend Affirmative Action case. Instead, to promote diversity, we should give preferential treatment to those students from low-income backgrounds and from difficult family situations, which is correlated with certain ethnic groups, but not identical. Sending underqualified students in place of qualified students to places of higher education hurts everyone involved. Our society at large is denied successful scholars, and those students who fail out at the end end up in a worse position than they were before. In summary, I told you about the history of affirmative action, some of the arguments surrounding affirmative action, and what we should do about it. The insanely high standards imposed on Asian Americans by affirmative action shows how ridiculous some of these policies have become. The most heinous unintended consequences of affirmative action is that it itself highlights race. The dream of a colorblind society will never be achieved while affirmative action is a policy in the United States. Dr. King's dream for his children being judged by the content of their character will never be fulfilled as long as official policy supports children to be judged by the color of their skin. Thank you.